I have a bit of a cold, but that will not deter me from teaching you the next lesson in how to draw. And it begins with a simple gesture. You've probably seen artists in movies, and they're always doing this kind of a thing. What is that about? Well, they're using their thumbs as measuring sticks, and that is an interesting and useful tool to help you understand the proportions of things, understand where something is relative to something else, to understand the angles that might be confounding you. I happen to use a pen a lot of the time rather than, where is it? Here it is. Rather than using my thumb, just because pens are longer. But what I like to do is I like to sort of look at the pen, hold it out at arm's length. Doesn't have to be exactly the same position from you, but just try and have a general sense of what your arm feels like when it's in that position, so that you can measure something, again, sighting with one eye, and say, okay, this object is 1 pen's length, and then I can turn it and say, and that part of it is 1 pen's length high. So for instance, if I was going to measure a building, I might hold it out at arm's length and say, okay, there are 2 pen lengths wide and 4 pen lengths tall. That's also going to help me to find where the middle of things are, or to find, for instance, where the windows are relative to the height of the building, or how wide each window is compared to the height of it. Those sorts of things. Now, you don't need to become crazed about this. You don't have to measure every single thing. We're not engineers, we're not architects, we're not making mechanical drawings. We're doing, a fun observational thing. But sometimes when you get a bit overwhelmed by the complexity of something, or particularly when it comes to proportions, just doing these little measuring exercises can help to place you, can help you avoid getting utterly lost. And so I want to show you, again, going back to our breakfast, I want to show you some steps in which we can understand this process better, possibly using our pen, but also, most importantly, I think, measuring things in the scene relative to each other. Okay, let's give that a try. Okay, so first of all, here's our little breakfast again, and we are going to measure the space here between that orange and the fork. And then when we do that, we see that distance is the same as the width of the fork itself. So that helps us to place those objects relative to each other. And now let's look, where else are the things that are that same width, that same length or width? Let's see, well, how about here, the width of that salt shaker? Again, the same width. Or the tines of the fork, the same as the base of the fork, so that gives us some indication. Okay, let's measure the height of that cup. Actually, it's not the same as the tines were, but it is the same height as the orange is. So that gives us a way of getting our bearings here. It's also the same as that part of the coffee pot. And what else? It's also the same as that section of the plate, the distance from the corner of the plate all the way to where it intersects with the edge of the cup. So that kind of measuring is helpful. Now let's measure the length of that part of the fork. And okay, that has a whole bunch of different things. The length of the bacon, the distance from the orange to the salt shaker, they're all the same length. So we can use those to judge and see how our drawing is doing. Now what about doing something like an arc? Here we have the arc of that plate. That seems like a long line to draw to try and capture the perfect kind of circularity of that line. It's a bit daunting, but let's just break it up into pieces, because actually it's a series of little pieces, right? The orange is one piece, then the distance to the fork, and so forth. So by breaking them up into these sections, it's much more manageable. They're shorter distances. Let's measure the distance there on the inside of the rim of the plate. We see that they're 2 pieces, but we see that they're also parallel to the line that we just drew over the top of the plate, so that makes things a little less threatening. Now, let's notice things like this circle in the coffee press, right? That circle is actually identical to the circle at the base of the coffee pot. but we can't see all of it. Similarly, when we look at this mug, we see that that circle at the top of the mug is actually the same as the circle on the bottom of the mug. But again, we don't see all of that bottom circle. Now, let's take the whole scene, okay, and let's draw a line that goes all the way across the middle of it. And how do we know that it's the middle? Because we've measured how far it is above and how far it is below, perhaps using our pen as a ruler. And now we measure the side to side. It's really helpful to have this particular measurement. It's probably the most important measurement you can do if you really want to place yourself in a complex area. Because when we put these two together, we see that the whole image now, the whole scene is cut into 4 sections. And that's really helpful because when we divide it up into 4 sections, we can approach each of these individual sections as much simpler things to draw. So we have one section there, and we have the details of that are fairly simple, right? There aren't really that many lines inside that quadrant. Now we look at this quadrant, again, a little bit more complicated, but not that bad. Now let's go to the third one, and here we see that really, there's the fork, there's the salt shaker, and there's the side of the coffee pot and of the orange, and finally our fourth quadrant, which is pretty simple too, right? So it's kind of breaking them down into smaller and smaller pieces makes them easier and more able to manage them. And then if we've drawn all 4 of them individually, there's no reason we can't draw all together, and we get the basic outlines. And these basic outlines and placements, they can help us to turn into, a much nicer drawing like this, where we really show all the complexity of that scene. Another thing that we can do when we divide it into quadrants is we can divide each quadrant in half. So we get this kind of a sighting thing that shows us, we can look at what is it that intersects each of these places, what intersects each of these marks on that quadrant sort of divider. And we can say, oh, the fork intersects right there. Oh, I see, the rim of the plate intersects right there. The edge of the coffee cup intersects right there. So again, it allows us to place it more easily. We can also divide a little square, a little rectangle there right in the center, and that little rectangle can actually be broken down into points, and those points we can say, oh, okay, one of the points happens to be where the plate and the mug intersect. One of them happens to be right above the tines of the fork where the salt shakers intersect. So again, these are all little places that help us to draw those landmarks, and the landmarks orient us and allow us to proceed from there. Okay, so next, let's try drawing just the outline again of the negative shapes. We've got the outlines of the main pieces because we did that little exercise. And then again, that allows us to get a more complex line drawing and to really have a sense of the place. So that's what we want to do now, is we want to take a fairly complicated scene. It could go back to our little still life that we set up a couple days ago, and to look at all the ways that these things intersect. Now, I don't want you to go crazy measuring every single intersection, every single thing relative to each other, but you'll find that if you can place 4 or 5 little landmarks like that, then the rest of it is kind of connect the dots. You're joining those things together, and you're seeing, so things, for instance, like perspective, that feel really intimidating because you feel like you have to understand the laws of perspective. In fact, if you do this kind of measuring, you can see how the sides of a chest of drawers or of a building or of a box of cereal, how they change over distance, so how the lines arc away from you. And you can do that just by measuring it without necessarily having to understand these laws of perspective. What we want to try to avoid, though, is getting too entranced by all this measurement, because it will really kind of, I think, suppress the sort of creative part of you that is enjoying doing this drawing. However, if you can find a few landmarks like this, it'll allow you to relax, to feel confident, and to just allow your powers of observation to fill all those bits in. Really what you're doing is you're breaking your drawing down into smaller drawings, simpler drawings, and then merging them together into one scene. So why don't you give that a try? Take your still life, make sure that it's kind of complicated with things intersecting each other, and measure some points around it, and try doing another contour drawing, and then filling in the bits. So that first contour drawing we did, where we just drew the outsides of stuff, now you're going to draw the interiors, interior landmarks and details, and you're going to have a sense of feeling, like you know where you are in this landscape. Okay? You're going to start drawing. Bye.